The guests in the corridor heard 4 shots, then silence. When they opened their doors, they saw a young man walking calmly past them, down the stairs, toward the hotel reception. At the front desk, without emotion, he spoke 7 words that would fill the newspapers for weeks. "I have just shot my father dead." What had happened inside room 267 at the Sturtevant House on Broadway that morning of June the 3rd, 1873. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you are from and what time you are watching. Your support helps us bring you more stories like this. Now, let us begin. It was Tuesday, the 3rd of June, 1873, in New York City. Dawn had broken pale over Broadway, and the gas lamps along the street were being extinguished one by one. The Sturtevant House Hotel stood 5 stories tall at the corner of Broadway and 29th Street, its limestone facade already warm in the early summer light. Inside, guests were beginning to stir. Porters moved quietly through carpeted hallways. From the street below came the sound of cartwheels on cobblestones and the first calls of vendors setting up their stalls. On the 4th floor, in room 267, a young man named Frank Hardin Woolworth had spent a restless night. He was 20 years old, tall and well-dressed, the eldest son of a once prominent family from Saratoga Springs. He had traveled down from Pine Grove the previous day by train, carrying with him a revolver and a letter that his father had written to his mother. The letter was filled with threats. Frank had left a note at his father's boarding house asking him to call at the hotel in the morning. At 6 o'clock, there was a knock at the door. Frank rose to answer it. Within minutes, 4 shots would echo through the corridor, and a young man would confess to patricide without shedding a single tear. Mansfield Woolworth had woken before dawn in his boarding house on West 11th Street. He was 42 years old, a failed author who had once lived in fine houses and now resided in rented rooms that smelled of damp and coal smoke. His marriage had ended. His father had died 6 years earlier, leaving him only an allowance administered by his elder brother. The grand inheritance he had expected never came. He dressed in a waistcoat that had seen better days and made his way through the empty streets toward Broadway. The morning was quiet. Shopkeepers were unlocking their doors. A milk cart passed, bottles rattling. Mansfield walked with purpose, his boots clicking against the pavement. He had received a note from his eldest son, asking to meet. He did not know what the boy wanted, but he went regardless. Their relationship had never been close. For years, Mansfield had lived apart from his children, seeing them only occasionally, writing letters to their mother that grew increasingly hostile with each passing month. He arrived at the Sturtevant House just after 6 o'clock. The morning porter directed him to the 4th floor, room 267. Mansfield climbed the stairs. The hotel was well appointed, far nicer than the boarding house where he now lived. The carpets were thick beneath his feet. Gas lamps flickered in their brass fixtures along the walls. He reached the door and knocked. Frank let him in without greeting. The room was neatly furnished with a bed, a writing desk, and a chair positioned near the window. Morning light streamed through the glass. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Frank closed the door behind his father and began to explain why he had asked him to come. He spoke of the letters. He spoke of his mother's distress. He asked his father to agree to reasonable terms for the divorce, to stop the threats, to leave his mother in peace. Mansfield listened, and then he became angry. His voice rose. He would not be dictated to by his own son. He would not be told what terms to accept. The argument escalated. Guests in nearby rooms heard the raised voices, but could not make out the words. Then came the shots, 4 of them, fired in quick succession. Then silence. The marriage had been troubled for years. Mansfield Tracy Woolworth and Ellen Douglas Hardin had wed in 1852 when he was 21 and she was 19. They were step-siblings. His father had married her mother the previous year, but such unions were not uncommon in their social circle. At first, they seemed well-matched. Both loved literature. Both came from families of means and influence. Ellen's father had been a congressman before dying in the Mexican War. Mansfield's father was a respected attorney in Saratoga Springs. But Mansfield was a difficult man. He was arrogant, temperamental, and quick to anger. His ambition was to become a published author, yet his work received only modest attention. His novels, A Tale of the Old Dutch Manor, Lula, Hotspur, were published but poorly reviewed. Critics found his prose overwrought, his characters unconvincing. Each failure deepened his bitterness. He began to blame others for his lack of success. He blamed his father for forcing him into law. He blamed his wife for distracting him from his writing. He blamed the critics for not understanding his genius. Ellen bore him 8 children between 1853 and 1871. With each pregnancy, Mansfield grew more distant. He spent months away from Saratoga Springs, taking rooms in New York City, claiming he needed solitude to write. Rumors circulated that he kept the company of other women. When he did return home, he was often intoxicated and abusive. He struck Ellen on multiple occasions. Once, during an argument in 1871, he bit her finger to the bone when she tried to defend herself. Her screams were heard throughout the house and in the street outside. Their son Frank, then 17, ran to her aid. After that incident, Ellen left Mansfield and returned to Kentucky with the children. She filed for divorce. Mansfield refused to accept her terms. He began writing letters, long, rambling letters filled with accusations and threats. He accused her of poisoning the children against him. He threatened to harm himself. He threatened to harm her. Ellen stopped reading the letters. She instructed Frank to intercept all correspondence from his father and keep it from her. Frank obeyed. The letters continued to arrive, week after week, each one more venomous than the last. When the shots ceased, the corridor fell silent. Several guests opened their doors cautiously and peered into the hallway. They saw a young man emerge from room 267. He was calm, his face expressionless. He walked past them without speaking, descended the stairs, and approached the front desk in the reception area. The porter on duty, a man named William Henderson, looked up from his ledger. Frank Woolworth stood before him and stated, in a clear and steady voice, that he had just shot and killed his father. He asked Henderson to fetch a policeman. The porter stared at him for a moment, uncertain whether he had heard correctly. Frank repeated the statement. Henderson sent a bellboy running into the street. Within minutes, a patrolman arrived. Frank surrendered his revolver without resistance, a small percussion pistol, still warm, 4 chambers discharged. He gave his name as Frank H. Woolworth, aged 20, residing at Pine Grove, Saratoga Springs. He confessed to shooting his father, Mansfield Woolworth, in room 267. The patrolman took him into custody and sent word to the station house on 13th Street. Other officers arrived at the hotel. They climbed to the 4th floor and entered room 267. The door was unlocked. Inside, they found Mansfield Woolworth lying on the floor near the writing desk. He had been shot 4 times. Twice in the chest, once in the abdomen, once in the shoulder. Blood had pooled beneath him and soaked into the carpet. The room otherwise appeared undisturbed. The bed was made, a chair was positioned by the window. On the desk lay a folded newspaper and a pen. The body was examined by the hotel physician, who pronounced Mansfield dead. The wounds were recorded in detail. Items in the room were catalogued: the newspaper, the pen, a valise containing Frank's belongings, and the letter. The letter Mansfield had written to Ellen, filled with threats and accusations. It was found in Frank's coat pocket. The officers read it, sealed it as evidence, and transported it to the station along with the revolver. By noon, the news had reached the newspapers. By evening, reporters had gathered outside the station house. The case had everything the public desired: wealth, family scandal, patricide. The headlines would be dramatic. The post-mortem examination was conducted on the 4th of June, 1873, by Dr. Samuel R. Percy, the city medical examiner. He observed that the deceased had sustained 4 gunshot wounds. The first had entered the left side of the chest between the 5th and 6th ribs, penetrating the lung and causing significant hemorrhage. The second had struck the right side of the chest, fracturing the 7th rib and passing through the liver. The third had entered the abdomen below the sternum, perforating the stomach. The fourth had lodged in the left shoulder, damaging muscle tissue but missing the bone. In Dr. Percy's opinion, any one of the chest wounds would have proven fatal within minutes. Death had been rapid, though not instantaneous. The man would have remained conscious for a brief period before succumbing to blood loss and internal injury. The wounds suggested that the shots had been fired from close range, no more than 6 feet distant. Powder burns were visible on the clothing. There were no signs of a struggle. The deceased bore no defensive wounds on his hands or arms. Samples of blood-soaked fabric were taken from the carpet and sealed in glass jars. The revolver was examined. 4 chambers had been discharged. 2 remained loaded. The weapon was a standard percussion model, commonly sold in the city. Nothing unusual about its design or manufacture. The letter found in Frank's possession was read aloud at the inquest. In it, Mansfield accused Ellen of manipulating their children, of keeping them from him, of turning them against their father. He threatened to end his own life if she did not relent. He threatened to come to Pine Grove and settle matters himself. The language was hostile, the tone increasingly erratic. It was dated the 28th of May, 1873, less than a week before the shooting. Witnesses from the hotel testified. They had heard raised voices, then gunshots. They had seen the young man walk calmly from the room. The prosecution noted this composure as evidence of calculation. The defense argued it was evidence of shock. If you are finding this case as compelling as we are, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It truly helps us continue researching and sharing these forgotten stories from history. We also read every comment, so let us know your thoughts on this case below. Now, let us continue. Frank Woolworth was formally charged with murder on the 5th of June. He was remanded to the Tombs prison to await trial. His mother, Ellen, traveled immediately from Kentucky to New York upon hearing the news. She engaged a lawyer, William F. Howe, known for his skill in defending difficult cases. Howe reviewed the evidence, the letters, the testimony, the medical reports. He began to construct a defense based not on denial, but on justification and mental state. The trial was scheduled to commence on the 24th of June, 1873, less than 3 weeks after the shooting. The trial opened at the Court of General Sessions in New York City on Tuesday, the 24th of June, 1873. The Honorable Judge George C. Barrett presided. The courtroom was filled with spectators, journalists, members of the public, representatives from both families. Ellen Woolworth sat in the gallery, pale and silent, watching as her son was brought to the defendant's table. The prosecution presented its case first. They called witnesses from the Sturtevant House who testified to Frank's calm demeanor after the shooting. They read aloud his confession. They argued that the act had been premeditated. Frank had traveled to New York specifically to meet his father, carrying a loaded revolver. This, they claimed, demonstrated intent. The defense countered by introducing the letters Mansfield had written to Ellen. The judge allowed them as evidence over the prosecution's objection. William Howe read several aloud to the jury. The language was vitriolic, threatening, deeply disturbing. Howe argued that Frank had been driven to desperation by years of witnessing his father's abuse of his mother. He called physicians who testified that Frank suffered from epilepsy, that he experienced seizures, that his mental faculties were impaired. They suggested that the stress of the confrontation had triggered a temporary loss of reason. The prosecution questioned the validity of the insanity defense. They pointed to Frank's rational behavior, his journey to New York, his methodical planning, his coherent confession. This was not the action of a man who had lost control, they argued, but of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The jury deliberated for several hours. When they returned, they delivered a verdict of guilty, but not of first-degree murder. 5 days before the shooting, the state of New York had passed a law distinguishing between premeditated murder and acts committed in the heat of passion or under diminished capacity. The jury found Frank guilty of second-degree murder. Judge Barrett sentenced him to life imprisonment at Sing Sing Correctional Facility. Frank showed no visible reaction. He was led from the courtroom in irons. Ellen wept quietly in the gallery. The case had concluded. The newspapers reported the verdict on their front pages. Public opinion was divided. Some believed justice had been served. Others thought the sentence too harsh, given the provocation. The file was sealed and sent to the archives. Frank Woolworth was transported to Sing Sing Prison on the 3rd of July, 1873. He was registered as prisoner number 4218. His cell was small, damp, and poorly lit. He was given a uniform and assigned to the workshop, where he spent his days making brushes and shoes. At night, he slept on a narrow cot and listened to the sounds of the prison: footsteps in corridors, the clanging of iron doors, the occasional cry of another inmate. Ellen did not abandon her son. She wrote to him weekly. She hired lawyers to appeal the verdict on the grounds of insanity. She petitioned the governor of New York for clemency. She submitted medical affidavits documenting Frank's epilepsy, his seizures, his fragile mental state. She argued that he had acted not with malice, but with desperation, driven beyond endurance by his father's cruelty. After 1 year of incarceration, Frank was transferred from Sing Sing to the State Lunatic Asylum at Auburn. The conditions there were marginally better. He was no longer confined to a cell, but resided in a ward with other patients. He was allowed to walk in the grounds. Doctors examined him regularly and confirmed the diagnosis of epilepsy. Ellen continued her campaign for his release. On the 1st of August, 1877, after 4 years and 2 months of confinement, Frank Woolworth was pardoned by Governor Lucius Robinson. The official document cited medical evidence and the mitigating circumstances of the case. Frank returned to Pine Grove. He was 24 years old, thin and pale, but free. He resumed a quiet life. In December of 1883, he married Corinne Bramlett, the daughter of a neighboring family. 3 years later, in 1886, Corinne gave birth to a daughter whom they named Clara. Frank's health, however, remained poor. He suffered from a chronic lung condition, likely tuberculosis contracted during his years in prison. On the 29th of October, 1886, he died at Pine Grove. He was 33 years old. Corinne and Clara survived him. Ellen lived for many more years. She never remarried. She remained at Pine Grove, tending the gardens, corresponding with friends, reading in the library where she and Mansfield had once shared their love of literature. She died in 1907 at the age of 74. The Sturtevant House Hotel continued to operate for decades. Room 267 was cleaned, repainted, and rented to other guests. No plaque marked what had occurred there. Over time, the story faded from public memory. The newspapers moved on to newer scandals. The court records were filed away in dust and silence. Only the name remained, recorded in faded ink on a ledger page. Frank H. Woolworth, convicted of second-degree murder, pardoned and released. Beyond that, only silence.